Today we are wrapping up ReNew series and talking about the future and what new thing God is doing. And we place a very high value on predicting the future. In whether it's sports, whether it's the weather, whether it's politics, whatever that it is. In fact, you can get rich if you can predict the future, if you can do a good job, and not only with sports events and I guess gambling, it does happen, and also in the stock market, investing in the stock market. When I was in high school, I tell people this is kind of like, everybody kind of has this is what Jesus saved me from story. I was the bookie of our high school. I ran the sports gambling ring of our high school. It wasn't that big, you put a quarter in there. But anyway, that was what I did. Tell people that just so they'll think I was a little edgy. I didn't really I wasn't a real rebellious kid. But so we place a high value on predicting the future. And I think that a part of the reason for that is that ordinarily, it's a supernatural gift. It's something that most human beings cannot do, to be able to predict what will happen, to predict the future. It's beyond human knowledge. You may be able to make your best guess about what will happen, but there's so many different things that could happen. There's so many variables, so many uncertain things that it's impossible to predict. You can make your best guess, but you can't really predict what will happen. So that's one reason why one of the cases that's made for believing in the God of the Bible is that the God of the Bible predicts what will happen in the future, and it comes to pass. In fact, there's one place, I believe it's in Deuteronomy, where God says, this is how you're going to tell a false prophet from a true prophet. What the true prophet says will come to pass. What the false prophet says will not come to pass. So that means, if you were alive at Y2K, there are certain people you should not listen to what they say anymore. If you remember that, you remember all that was going to happen if you believed all of that. And so, but we are fascinated with the future, and we're fascinated with passages of the Bible that will tell us about the future. In fact, there's one particular book of the Bible that gets a lot of attention about the future. Everyone wants you to teach it, and every time I've taught it, there's always been a lot of interest at the beginning, and then after the first week, people never come back because they realize it's not going to tell them what they think, or at least what they think, and that's the book of Revelation at the end of the Bible. I think it is about the future, but it's not just about the future. It's about much more from the days that it was written. But there's another book of the Bible, probably second only to Revelation, that gets the most attention about predicting the future, and that's the book of Isaiah. Isaiah is quoted a lot, especially leading up to Christmas time. There's a lot of different passages in Isaiah that predict the one that's going to come, predicting about the future. And particularly in the middle to latter portions of Isaiah, there's a great deal of speaking that's of course written hundreds of years before Christ, but nevertheless is significant because Isaiah speaks about an individual known as the servant, or you could describe him as my servant, or as the servant. Okay? Do I have that on the slide? Do I have the word the servant? There it is. The servant. Okay, there he is. And so the thing about Isaiah is that Isaiah talks about the future and talks about this servant, and it's so often quoted by Christians. And it's hundreds of years before Christ, and so it's predicting something in the future that might not be as interesting to us as Revelation would be, but it should be. It should be. And it's interesting about Isaiah is because when the Dead Sea Scrolls were discovered in Qumran in Israel, they found almost a complete scroll of the book of Isaiah. And it was almost word for word the same as the Isaiah in your Bibles, even though it's over 1,000 years older than the oldest manuscript, which is so significant. Because Isaiah has a lot to say about this servant. In fact, for the people of Israel, a lot of people say, well, who is this servant that Isaiah is speaking about? If you were to ask a Jewish rabbi today, who is the servant, which is introduced around Isaiah chapter 41 and goes to the next 20 plus chapters, this servant is referred to and spoken about, that rabbi would tell you that the servant is Israel. Back in Isaiah chapter 41, verse 8, He says specifically, God says specifically, you, Israel, my servant, Jacob, whom I have chosen, you descendants of Abraham, my friend. So Israel is the servant. But then there are places where this as a personified version of Israel, this is a one particular individual that is spoken of that is more than just a nation, but as a person. Could it be that this servant is embodied in a particular person, in a particular individual? Well, in Isaiah chapter 43, verse 19, God says that I'm doing a new thing. Now it springs up. Do you not perceive it? I am making a way in the wilderness and streams in the wasteland. And in Isaiah chapter 42, verse 9, God says that the former things have taken place and new things I declare. Before they spring into being, I announce them to you. I'm about to tell you what's going to take place in the future. So we lean in. What is going to happen? And so we find out what will happen through this servant who is an embodied representative of the people of Israel. What will this servant do? Well, Isaiah 42 is where we're focusing today. If you have your Bibles, you can open up those first 9 verses of Isaiah chapter 42. Go into verse 1 of Isaiah chapter 42. This is what we see about this servant. This is what God says this servant will do. Here is my servant, whom I uphold, my chosen one, in whom I delight, or in whom I am well pleased. I will put my spirit on him. You could describe it sort of like being anointed with the Spirit. Anointing was a sign of being set apart, of being chosen. This chosen one will be anointed with the Spirit. I will put my Spirit on him. He will bring justice to the nations. Talk more about that in just a second. So this is a chosen individual who will bring justice to the nations. Verse 2. He will not shout or cry out. Okay? He will not use his loud voice, his outside voice, what we talk about, okay? My children, okay, they're very loud. Especially my middle child, James. He's very loud, and so sometimes it's very loud in my ear, which causes me to make me think I'm going deaf early. But this servant will not shout or cry out or raise his voice in the streets. A bruised reed he will not break, and a smoldering wick he will not snuff out. Now, for a long time when I read this, I thought that the bruised reed and the smoldering wick is a reference to the servant himself. Because in places, in later chapters, the servant is described as one who is a man of sorrows, one familiar with suffering, one who will be rejected, by whose stripes we are healed. That means he will be beaten. And so I thought the one who's bruised must be a reference to the servant himself, but actually it's not in this case. He's talking about those who are bruised, or the smoldering wick, that which is about to go out, that which might seem to be worthless or unusable or useless is not useless to the servant. He's not going to break the one that's bruised, not going to snuff out the one that's barely hanging on and about to be extinguished. Continuing in verse 3. In other words, you can say he will have a mind toward the weak. He will be sensitive. He will be tender, compassionate toward the weak. In faithfulness, he will bring forth justice. He will not falter or discourage. In other words, he will encounter opposition. He will be rejected. It's not going to be easy, but in the face of that, he will not falter or discourage. He will fulfill his calling. He will not falter or discourage until he has established justice on earth. In his teachings, the islands will put their hopes. Now, this is 3 times this word justice has been used. And in the use of the prophets of the Old Testament, frequently there is a reference to justice. There is this understanding that when the peoples of the worlds, in fact, we talk about islands here, which is the faraway lands, that's the Gentile, that's however, Israel, wherever, like America's far away from wherever they were, the islands was the distant people. They didn't know the Americas exist, of course, but that's a reference to the faraway people, those who are not us. But even though they're not of us, and even though they're not related to us, and even though they don't worship the same God as us yet, they will put their hope in His teaching. And when the whole world comes to know the teaching of the servant, which is the teaching of the Lord God, then justice will be established. When the knowledge of God is prevalent over the whole earth, and God's righteousness and God's truth is established, His character is mirrored in the behavior of the peoples of the earth. This is the establishment of God's justice, which is something that the servant is given responsibility to do. Continues in verse 5. And then God begins to speak directly to the servant. This is what God the Lord says. The creator of the heavens, who stretches them out, who spreads out the earth with all that springs from it, who gives breath to its people and life to those who walk on it. Oftentimes, and especially in these chapters of Isaiah, God says, it's a reminder of the character, the nature of God, because the people of Israel were shaken, their temple had been destroyed, they had been carried out of their homeland, and so God is constantly reminding them, I'm the one who governs everything. I'm the one who made it all, okay? And this is what God says to the servant. This is important, okay? Verse 6. I, the Lord, have called you in righteousness. I will take hold of your hand. In other words, I will guide you. I will keep you. In other words, I will protect you. And will make you to be a covenant for the people. Now, a covenant is a binding promise between two peoples, two parties, where there's an oath that is made and a relationship is established. And so this servant will be a means by which a covenant is brought to all peoples. I mean, God had a covenant with Israel that He made with them at Sinai, but this individual, this servant, will be a covenant for all people, will establish a covenant with even the Gentiles, to be a light for the Gentiles. And for the Jewish person, light, illumination coming from God was the highest state of existence. That is what is to be pursued. An individual could not have it apart from revelation from God. That light is given from God. And He says, in fact, and that light is embodied in what that servant will do. Verse 7, that He will open the eyes that are blind. He will free captives from prison and release from the dungeon those who sit in darkness. This is a new idea. I mean, the freedom from darkness, the release of captives, free captives, release from the dungeon, those who sit in darkness. I mean, that's kind of familiar with Israel's story. They have been slaves. God has set them free. But this idea of the eyes of the blind being opened, this is a new thing. This is a new idea. Unless you go back all the way to the very beginning in Genesis 1 where God says, let there be light, right? Opening the eyes of the blind. Well, this servant, we've already seen in chapter 41, I just showed you this in the chapter before this. This servant, God says, is Israel. And that's Israel's job. Israel was to be a light for the Gentiles. The whole world was to look at Israel and how Israel lived under God's law and said, this is an example of that they live by different priorities, this is an example. We see what God is like by looking at Israel. That's what part of what God says when He says that I mean that you are to be holy. You are to be different. God's story, God's revelation was different than the other nations. So the servant was to be embodied in Israel. But guess what happened? Israel had not fulfilled that. They had fallen short. They were in exile as a result of their failures to be that servant. But here's the word from God, is that the hope of that realization is not lost, is not gone. But for you and I, looking back from the future, we see the servant as more than just Israel, right? We see the servant is fulfilled in Jesus. Jesus is the embodiment of Israel. Everything that Israel should have been and wasn't, Jesus was. Is there any coincidence that Jesus was tempted for how long in the wilderness? 40 days. How long was Israel in the wilderness? 40 years. Where Israel failed, Jesus succeeds. And when Jesus is baptized, when he comes out of the waters, it says the heavens are opened and the Holy Spirit descends upon him. He is anointed by the Spirit, and a voice from heaven speaks and says, what? You are my son, which is a quote from Psalm 2, with whom I am well pleased, or in whom is my delight. He quotes Isaiah 42. The voice from heaven, God the Father, quotes Isaiah 42. This, you are my servant, anointed by the Spirit. I poured my Spirit out on you, and in you is my delight. Jesus is the servant. And so it's no coincidence that when Jesus preaches his first sermon, in Luke chapter 4, when he stands up in the synagogue at his home church, and he opens the scroll, it's no coincidence he turns to Isaiah. And this is what he says. The Spirit of the Lord is on me because he has anointed me. I've been anointed by the Spirit, the Holy Spirit, to proclaim good news to the poor. He has sent me to, here are the three things that we just saw: proclaim freedom for the prisoners, recovery of sight for the blind, and to set the oppressed free. Jesus says, this is my mission. The servant's mission is my mission. What the servant is supposed to do is what I will do. And so when we see what God says that he's going to do a new thing, in Isaiah chapter 43:19, our theme verse for this series. God says, I'm doing a new thing. Do you not perceive it? I'm making a way in the wilderness and streams in the wasteland. We see that God's plan is that the whole earth would know the Lord, that his righteousness and truth would be established, his values established in the earth, justice to be established to where the far-off peoples would know him, so that there might be a covenant that would be made with the nations, so that there might be a way in the wilderness and streams in the wasteland and all these things that would be established. Is all of these promises to be fulfilled, is it just pointing toward Jesus? That Jesus would accomplish this. And when Jesus has done it, he's died on the cross, he's raised from the dead, he's ascended to heaven, then it's all done. Nothing else to be done. Jesus done it all. I don't think so. I don't think it's just pointing to Jesus. I think it's also pointing to a different or a continuation of the story, a servant or a group of servants. Because you see, the former things, what happened in the past, they predict the future things. The former things predict the future. You can understand what will happen in the future and predict what will happen in the future by looking to the past. And while the servant is Jesus, and Jesus fulfilled everything that servant should have been, especially when you look in not just Isaiah 42, but we especially see when you get in Isaiah 53 in the description of the sufferings of the servant. But the servant isn't just Jesus. And the servant isn't just Israel. The servant is us. Mulder Memorial United Methodist Church. You and me. We are the servant of the Lord. And Jesus succeeded where all of us fail. But that's no excuse for us to continue to fail. In fact, the mission of Jesus is now entrusted to us. Let's look at that again. Let's look at that verse again. To open eyes that are blind, to free captives from prison, to release from the dungeon those who sit in darkness. This is what the servant of the Lord does by the power of the Spirit of the Lord, not in their own strength. And this is what the Spirit of the Lord does through us, through you and me. And this is what the Spirit will continue to do through us. A little clip show you an example of this powerful idea of the blind receiving sight. You know, that still happens today. Sometimes it happens through a miracle. Sometimes it happens through a miracle of supernatural means. Sometimes it happens through the miracle of technology, through medicine. I've got a clip here of a child, a young child, being able to see, receiving gift through glasses to be able to see clearly for the first time. We could roll that.
Hi. Hi. How are you? Hi. Yeah. What do you think, huh? Can you wave hi?
That's what happens when somebody comes to know Jesus. To go from a place of not being able to see. I once was lost, but now am found, was blind, but now I see. To open the eyes of the soul that is blind. To free captives from prison. Not necessarily talking about literally setting people free from prison, although it might be. Certainly not before they're, not breaking someone out. We're not doing Shawshank Redemption kind of deal here. But I'm talking about what put them there. Released from the dungeon of darkness, whether it's addiction, whatever it is that keeps us bound in misery, keeps us from enjoying the freedom and the wholeness that God desires for us. There's a spiritual enemy that holds us captive. The servant comes to set them free. One of my mentors in ministry is Herb Sadler. He's a pastor, a longtime pastor of Gulf Breeze United Methodist Church near Pensacola. And he would say that hope is more powerful than memory. As powerful as memory is to us, that hope is even more powerful. What pushes us forward. And Isaiah is pretty bold in predicting the future, and what he predicts comes to pass. And that's why so many Christians point back to Isaiah, written centuries before Christ. Now we know for sure it was written centuries before Christ, to say, look what he said and look how it was fulfilled. Could this not be of God? Isaiah predicted the future and it came to pass. Well, I predict that here at Mulder, that whatever happens, whatever future that God leads us into, this is going to keep happening. Eyes being opened. Those in the bondage of sin being set free. Releasing those who are in darkness away from the light of God. This is the servant's mission. This is our mission. This is your mission.